to open today's debate. Here.
Just a second.
Start.
Ladies and gentlemen, in Greece, when they had their crisis, instead of taking the loan from the EU, instead of getting that bailout that was given to them on a silver platter, they held a referendum. And because the people said that they would rather not take the loan, they would rather take the austerity, they would rather not take austerity measures, they were put into debt. They are still in debt to this day. Let us be very clear from opening government. We will have a government still, but this will be a government of technocrats. We are still fine with giving away passive things as in welfare and like pension. Those things will continue to go on. But we say that we must have a institution run by Democrats. So the only way we will allow these Democrats to be removed is by things like KPI, things like peer review. If they can prove that the merit of this technocrat is not good enough, then they are allowed to be removed. But other than that, we think it's fine. We say that we are opposed to anything sort of an election during this time. We say that whatever the technocrat and the group of technocrats says, that is what we're going to do. We are opposed to referendum action. We define a crisis as anything that can cause mass panic or a massive fluctuation in the norm. This looks like a health crisis. This looks like a national disaster. This looks like a terrorist attack or a state under invasion, anything of that sort. We will also establish tenure. So these technocrats can't be pushed out by politicians. They must be pushed out based on merit. And this merit has to be like sufficiently proven with evidence. We define technocracy as something that has individuals who are well trained, who are also independent from the government. These will be people who are like third-party academics. They must be highly qualified, but we also prefer for them to have a record in public service and things like that. One example is how we think that in Malaysia, during the times of the corona crisis, we took advice from Mercy Malaysia, and that has helped us recover so much more. Anything government bench tells you from this point is derivative of these concepts. The government can either do this clandestinely or they can do it like silently, right? And we will also say that we want to transition back into our democracy right after the crisis is over. We will have, of course, transition policies that will make sure it is smooth. Since this is a prefer motion, opposition has to defend things like proceeding with elections, proceeding with referendums that have caused things like Brexit, that have caused mass amounts of harm on the world scale. Two arguments to it today. Why? Number one, governments are unequipped and the value of merit that a technocracy brings to the table. Before I go on.
Taken.
Sir, if your problem is that Democrats cannot make proper decisions, why won't you let technocrats stay in power after the crisis is over?
We believe that when it comes to a crisis itself, the sole purpose of a technocrat will be very different from a purpose of a politician. We are going to prove to you that there are political incentives tied to that, and those political incentives are unnecessary in a time of crisis. We don't have to defend why those political incentives are necessary after the crisis. That's not our burden. First thing, a principle coming from opening government. There is a principal duty and a principal right that governments can have to suspend the rights of the people during a time of crisis. The government already takes into account the well-being of every individual under its states. There is so much legal precedence to this idea. This looks like the government taking away rights during curfew, martial law, all of these things, the acknowledgement of classified files by the military. All of these things are unquestioned because there is an understanding that the state manages your life. The state manages your EPF, your ability to immigrate and emigrate out of the state. We say that individuals are fine with this. But also notice for the fact that under their world, these individuals don't have much else of a choice either. We are going to continue to preserve democracy. This is why we see governments in Hungary suspend elections during times of crisis, because it's understood that democracy has no place during that crisis. Number two, second level, panic colors the lenses of the layman. The three levels to this. Number one, I don't think the government can run efficiently because most of the things they're going to do is propose populist policies. This means that in Greece, in order to remain powerful, in order to remain elected in the next instance, they decided to give the will of the people what they want. In the Philippines, instead of like understanding that there is a trial and due into all of the drug dealers that he killed, they decided to wipe them out because if there was a will of the people. Those are things that have caused them accidental deaths, accidental like firings and shootings within the country itself. We think there's a massive amount of harm, and governments will always run the populist policy. But the second layer of this is that people's opinions themselves are skewed in times of crisis. In times of crisis, things often become so sensationalized to the point that random facts get pushed out and you have no discernment whether to tell them from not. We contest the idea that people ever really make the true decision during a crisis, right? This looks like things like fake news being spread out during Brexit. This looks like things like fake mass panic and people wanting to go out during times of the coronavirus because they are self-interested and they do not have an interest to the state. We say that when those things happen, that's when you get people who don't want a social distance. Third thing, we prevent the indoctrination of the people through government policies. When a government is in crisis, no thank you, they are likely to give you things that are to distract you. This looks like the wall in the United States. This looks like various other policies that are made with the intention of distracting people with a much larger outrage. It looks like scapegoating minorities. It looks like blaming the Jews in the time of the recession of Germany. We say they have to defend all of these three links if they want to prove why panic doesn't happen on a mass scale. But finally, I also think that politicians have an inability to listen to technocrats. This is why op can't just say they want them by their side. We look at people like Donald Trump, like Harry Truman bombing like Japan and stuff like that. It's not that they don't already have this kind of advice, it's that they don't want to listen to it because of all those political incentives. Finally, what difference does a technocrat bring to a table? 3 levels. 1, a technocrat is free from this political incentive. We say that technocrats have the sole intention of only wanting to produce the largest merit on society. These are individuals with a large confidence in their ability to affect things, and they are also supported by other individuals. And if they get it wrong, they have peer review to keep them in check. Second thing, that makes them more accountable than any politician, right? The same reason of why, if you suspend an election on the other side, or like you continue with a referendum, they are not accountable. They can't be moved out. It's very difficult to remove a politician. But the final thing is we remove from the bias of political incentives. When Ukraine was suffering from the bombing, they did not seek help from the United States. Suffering from Chernobyl, they did not seek help from the United States because the Soviet Union was against capitalism. These are the things we propose to you. And when they have to defend change, we like to say we don't know what they're talking about.
Right, I think that's the end of the speech. I'd like to call on the leader of opposition to begin their team's case. Here.
Please give me a few seconds.
Oh, good. Take your time, please.
Start.
We can recognize that the principles by which the government side runs their case is exactly why they're unable to actually represent the needs of citizens within a crisis. To take the examples of inefficient measures of democracy to represent democratic values as a whole, and to use that to prove that democracy should be forgoed in certain situations of crises is exactly what we're going against because of the principles of democracy not being something that can be compromised because of difficult situations. We'd like to recontextualize some points before we move on. We'd like to first talk about what actually happens in terms of a crisis, especially within a democratic state. We believe that one very influential factor to the actual chaos that ensues during a crisis is the fact that communications are cut off. Right? It's not necessarily the fact that democratic values are causing that chaos. It's the fact that there's no means to actually communicate by the public. Media is cut off, communications are cut off, and these means of communication, when they're absent and unavailable, is also one of the reasons why individuals feel there is a bigger crisis occurring. And therefore, to state that simply a technocratic state that actually cuts off all of these forms of communications will actually cause more peace is not necessarily an analysis that makes sense to begin with. Also, second, we believe that they have to engage with the fact that they're not simply granting technocrats the ability to input their opinions within political discussions. They are being the placeholders of political leaders. Therefore, they are to an extent representing their political beliefs by being in such a position. It's replacement rather than simply inputting and adding this to the current forms of government. What they have to defend is absolutely and only technological political regimes. We will, of course, on the opposition side, we can also have an increasement of boards behind leaders that will represent the ideas given to them by the board. And if the citizens are actually agreeing with that, then the actual solutions will be ensued. It will be that they have a lack of engagement with this entire context, that it will be only and entirely the technocrats who are actually going to be engaging in political discussions and political decisions as well. Under this, we have two main points that we'd like to deliver to you. First is regarding the government's duty and what a leader needs in terms of qualities within a crisis. And second, the principles of democracy and why they can't be forgone under situations of crises. Let's first talk about the government's duty and what kind of qualities people are looking for within a leader during a crisis. We believe that, first of all, there is a lack of accountability present in terms of crises, in terms of the government. What we mean by this is, like previously mentioned, things about the lack of media and the lack of communications, in which case the government is the only entity that can actually ground ground the opinions and ground the representation of individuals. These crises actually cause for a bigger reason why governments need to hold the accountability than previous situations. Second of all, we believe that technological support isn't necessarily what is only necessary with absolutely needed in cases of a crisis. We believe that something that is also necessary for in terms of crisis are spiritual and political support by the leader. A leader that represents the actual spirit of the nation, the leader that represents the political opinions of nature. Social cohesion is actually a very imperative measure, that an imperative factor in terms of maintaining the nation within situations of crises. Maybe that often crises are the backbone of actually enraging political conflict. This is because many people believe that their opinions are not appreciated and their circumstances are not represented within the government. We believe that rather, because of the lack of social cohesion that occurs to the lack of communication within situations of crises, these are when political crises and political conflicts ensue after a crisis. We believe that when communication and when engagement with the citizens is entirely avoided by the government, this is when political disagreement rises. This is when political conflict arises, and when there's no entity to speak up, an entity to actually input their opinions and pass their opinions through. And this absence is exactly what causes political conflict to begin with. We believe that in these circumstances, what the government needs to work on is not necessarily simply gathering more methods of actually providing technological support, but gathering more methods to actually ensure that the citizens feel their opinions are being appreciated. We believe that this kind of social cohesion is actually one of the most imperative factors when it comes to political conflicts, especially within democratic states. But before we move on, let's take a point.
In most countries, central banks, based on their expertise, act like technocrats in setting interest rates because they're the only ones who would know how to do such. Do you support central banks?
We believe that what we want to talk about is actually who is the representative body, and therefore, if there is technological experts, and like you said, the central bank that is actually putting their opinions through a body that is representative of the political opinions, then we believe that that is actually much better than having simply leaving it entirely up to entities like the central bank to actually make political decisions as well. We are talking about the party that is the actual party that is decisive in terms of actually making and executing serving the actual demands of the public. Second of all, we'd like to talk about why democracy is absolute and it cannot be forgotten in situations of crises. We believe our number one crisis, held technocracies will have more control over their decisions than a democracy. This means that there is entirely an absence of a system of check and balance or a mechanism of check and balance. Wrong actions aren't held accountable for because there is no input, and therefore, even if we assume that even if we agree that experts in whatever field are more knowledgeable than our politicians, if they do make mistakes, which is something that is very prone to in any individual or any entity, we believe that there is no actual way to check that because it is a technocracy in which they have entire control. This is exactly why in the long term this can lead to dictatorial regimes. We believe that this is what leads to autocratic states and dictatorial regimes because there is no representation of political interest to hold the government accountable for the decisions that they're making. The problem with this is that after the system of crisis has actually ended, this leads to a much more prolonged state of instability because this can lead to dictatorial and autocratic states that are very hard to take back power from. Unless there's a specific mechanism that the government can provide to you as to how this technocracy can immediately end after the crisis has gone down, we believe this is an entirely unstable way of actually providing a solution. A more stable solution would be to actually find a means to both represent and to actually input the technological components of a crisis.
Right, I thank that speaker for their speech. I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue their team's case. Hear, hear.
Start.
Chair, recognize that this isn't a policy debate. This is a prefer motion. This is an evaluation of which party and which actor do we trust most in times of crisis and which can properly solve and handle a massive crisis that is nationwide. We think that democracies are oftentimes flawed, and the reason being there's a differentiation between popular mandate and times of crisis is simply because crisis is something that affects a large group of people and oftentimes the harms are different. The first thing I do is to differentiate because recognize the side of government isn't supporting a autocracy. We aren't supporting technocrats taking over forever because recognize we think that in times of crisis the major differentiation factor is that a lot of decisions during popular mandate don't cause widespread harms. In times of crisis, oftentimes it's an exception because the scale of harm is massive and the urgent recovery period determines your fundamental human rights. This means that if you don't recover from this crisis, I think a lot of other rights are oftentimes lost. And recognize that in normal circumstances, individuals who are the check and balances to governments are oftentimes people. We posit to you that during a time of crisis, individuals oftentimes don't act as a check and balance because oftentimes there's a massive panic and a massive vulnerability towards in terms of the general public. Hence, we say that governments oftentimes aren't able to be held accountable and are bad actors, especially during times of crisis. We posit to you that we don't have to take the burden of proving to you how they will transition because it's a preferred motion. We will explain to you why in times of crisis they're better at handling a technocracy is better at handling the crisis. Recognize in terms of the leader of opposition, they don't prove to you how they're ever able to solve the crisis. All they say are arbitrary principles such as apparently democracy is absolute and cannot be taken away, or individuals need to feel more comforted. Several responses before I move on. The first thing they say is that oftentimes during a form of crisis, there's no means to communicate with public, and oftentimes this leads to bigger crisis. I agree. I think this oftentimes only leads to a lot of their outcomes being far worse because recognize it does oftentimes communication is flawed. Oftentimes there's a spread of large-scale fake news. People are oftentimes in massive panic. I don't think the decisions individuals make on the ground or the necessary public opinion is one that's legitimate because recognize the spread of information is one that's already hampered and one that's already flawed. I think that you saying that people must hold them accountable, you need to tell us why individuals are in the right state of mind. The second thing they say are that because recognize they try to paint to us a picture where give technocrats too much power. We recognize that we've already told you that these individuals are oftentimes individuals who are held accountable by the fact that that we give them KPIs, for example, or like peer reviews where they're put in positions of power. These are experts who have like made massive decisions, but also contributed in service in
Point.
for example, where they have like the public interest at mind. I think at this point, governments they still have the public interest at heart, and they're able to handle crisis far better. The third thing they say are citizens must feel that their opinions are heard. I think that they don't explain to us what the importance is, because recognize that I don't think this is important insofar as if there's a massive
Point.
the harm is far worse. The last thing they say is that that democracy is absolute, and apparently we can't hamper that. Recognize that if it's true that this crisis continues, but also we've proven to you a picture in which, like for example, in Hungary, when their leader literally suspended elections and like gave himself like a period of time where he can rule like without any elections and any check and balances. He even like gave himself executive power. This is when democracy oftentimes fails. There's a lot of flaws in democracy. Democracy isn't oftentimes absolute, because recognize there's things like flawed accountability, distract during elections. It's also subject to lobbying during times of crisis. I think oftentimes you need to tell me why democracy is upheld on your world. First extension, while technocrats are far better in handling the crisis, recognized governments oftentimes have always made really bad decisions simply because they want to pander to the majority of public. Oftentimes,
Point.
they sway information, and they like the fact that they have large control over public opinion means that they push the burden onto other issues. For example, things like racism or like create tension within society. For example, Donald Trump, because there's an issue he can't solve, he simply pins the burden upon things like migrants, for example. We think this doesn't happen in a technocracy, because recognize they don't have a perverse incentive
Point.
to public support or like to garner political support. Their motivation is simply to get over that crisis. Hence, I think a technocracy is far more effective. But also in the case of Greece, for example, when like governments literally, because they wanted to pander to the public, they literally the reason why Greece is in massive bankruptcy for years is because they rejected a loan from the IMF simply because people were afraid and like they had false perceptions of how their future is going to be like, because recognize people are easily swayed, and governments oftentimes follow that sway and make really bad decisions. For example, they need to defend a world of Greece where they live in, and recognize also that these decisions are irreversible. They need to defend a world where these irreversible decisions are, the harm is perpetual. Recognize Greece cannot change their fate, because recognize the harm has already been done. They've been in bankruptcy forever simply because of the decisions the people made. We think that technocrats are far better because recognize they have all the information that's needed. They also have a lot of connections. They understand the best ways to solve the crisis, and I think that that's why technocrats are far more effective. I think given the fact that governments have also proved to prioritize their own power, oftentimes this leads to things like them taking in power, and that's what leads to a dictatorship. Because recognize in times of crisis, when people are desperate, governments have power that is equal to things like an authoritarian state, because there's no check and balance anymore. We think a lot of times check and balances fail because people are vulnerable. People oftentimes fall for things like false news and populism. We think that there's ultimately no check and balance to the government, and hence we prefer a technocracy, because the benefit of a technocracy is them always wanting to solve the crisis, and that's how we're able to get out of times of crisis. Proud to propose.
Right, before I call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition, I just need to fix my Wi-Fi. I have very terrible Australian internet, so please bear with me for half a minute. Thank you. All right. Sorry for that. I'm back. I'd like to call upon the deputy leader of opposition to continue their team's case. Here.
Start.
Government team needed to do much more than what they already did for them to take this debate home. We gave you two burdens at the very top of the speech that I'm going to clarify now that we didn't hear adequate or sufficient analysis coming from government to support. The first thing is they need to prove to us why a technocracy, more than any other form of provisional government, for example, or even like the referendum that their first speaker so conveniently brought up to us for his introduction, should not be an alternative measure that is proposed during times of crises. But second of all, and perhaps more importantly, they needed to prove to us why a technocracy is more valuable than any other tenets of democracy, which we tell you you must necessarily forego if you decided to institute a technocracy over democracy in these times of crisis. I'll examine these two burdens through my speech as well. First, I want to levy a couple of rebuttals against government side, and then I'll introduce the last argument, which is going to be a macro analysis of the comparatives of government function and the implications on society. This is also going to be largely responsive to the new material or the extensions that we heard from their DPM. So first on the government case. So basically, they open up by saying that there's going to be tenure for technocrats, which is going to be based on their technological merit. First of all, I would tell you that most of the times, technocrats or any imposition of an elite that holds power during times of crisis has an extremely bad precedent throughout history of becoming dictators or even turning into autocracies. No, thank you. Like this is exactly what we saw in Hungary with Viktor Orban taking control after after their economic crisis. And this is also what we saw in Argentina after the Guerra Sucia, like the war that happened within the country. This is because when you concentrate the government in the hands of a few who can blind the public to their actions because it's in a time of chaos and crisis, then you consolidate and entrench this state of elitism without an actual measure to vote these candidates out of office. But second of all, we would tell you that even if this weren't to be true and we were to take them at the very best and say that, well, these technocrats are ensured by tenure or that they are going to be voted out or like that they're not going to be able to retain their position if they're no longer like technologically meritable and therefore they're held accountable, we will tell you why fundamentally a technocracy is not the most desirable government form compared to a democracy during times of crisis. No thanks. So the first argument they give us with a lot of subpoints is like why the government is unequipped and the value of a technocracy. The first thing they say is that you suspend the power of people during a crisis during other times, so why not do that here as well? Well, first of all, I would say that the examples they brought up as well, the logic I want to give you is that you suspend the ability to, for example, mobilize or the right to consume freely, like rations during warfare, but you never get rid of an individual's right to vote because whereas all others are based on, for example, checking the policies of a candidate, to right to vote is the only single measure that exists within any government system or a nation against the candidate themselves. And the only way to like make sure that candidate does not retain the position if they're not fulfilling the needs of the people. The second thing we hear under this argument is that the panic of the people is going to lead to them not being able to make rational judgments and therefore they vote more for like populist policies. First thing to say against this is that, well, we also think we can propose alternatives on opposition side, like for example, ways to increase advertisements or regional debates for campaign exposure with the public. But second of all, even if this weren't true, we would still tell you that they have even less accountability on their side and therefore they exacerbate extreme policies like populism or socialism. Because if the government is cut off from communication with the people, which is what happens during times of crisis, where, for example, media infrastructures might have degenerated, then this means that innate government measures still need to exist to at least maintain accountability on that federal and republic level, that we don't think is going to happen under their side. But the third thing we hear is that you prevent indoctrination of people on their side through government policies. They gave examples of blaming or scapegoating minorities. Well, first of all, I would say that whereas in government, whereas in a democratic government, you have a diversity of ethnic and diverse ethnicities
Point.
and identities of different candidates, you don't actually elect people based on their social views or their political views on government side, where you endorse the technocracy through like technocrat candidates. So we don't actually think that they're able to gain more representation and therefore decrease the chances that
Point.
governments are even going to levy such harmful like rhetoric against specific minorities or demographics of people anyway.
Point.
But then the last thing that they say in their second argument then quickly is about like, what does technocracy actually bring you? They talked about like the sole intention of bringing large merit, that these people are not politically incentivized and therefore they don't have those biases, and therefore conclusion is that they will be more accountable. Couple things to say is, first of all,
Point.
they can fiat, like, because the motion already says that these people are going to be like voted into office based on the technological merit. But I don't think on the flip side that they can fiat that these people will be removed from office using the same types of mechanisms, given what I already told you against their tenure policy. But even if we were to take them at their best and say that this does happen, first of all, I don't think it's true like why these like people won't be politically incentivized either, because there are also candidates that have been given a significant degree of political power and status within that certain society. But second of all, on the comparative, we already told you a lot about why there is a reason why there are different branches of government in the first place, and that not all parts of government or programs within government are meant to be operated on simply technological knowledge. Plus, there's also the role of the leader as well, which we think is to be like the figurehead of that society, to be the face that calms down the people and brings together a collective fabric of social identity and unity. All of these were points that my leader of opposition explained very clearly and thoroughly, and we did not hear sufficient response coming from DPM. But this is the most important thing in this debate, because we think this is ultimately going to be the very role of a government that needs to be defended within times of crisis, that can only happen under a democratic form of government and not a technocracy like they try to insist. Then the last argument, which incorporates a lot of DPM's material, is going to be a very, very comparative one. So the first thing that we heard from their side, so this is the very best case of OG, is that the government operates on like peer review and they're not susceptible to lobbying. All of this to just say that they're more accountable. Actually, I would say that whatever they gave us in terms of their logic works on the flip side, because if it's true that these people aren't actually politically motivated, then this means that even when voters this necessarily has to mean that voter calls as well as the power of the constituency no longer matter to these people. Like, the only reason why we're able to keep political candidates in check is simply because of their political motives. It becomes much harder, especially for minority demographics, when their calls rest entirely on representation by specific politicians. This means that you can get discrimination in terms of where these technocrats decide to concentrate infrastructure only in like the most populated or the wealthiest elites, or in places where social minorities maybe do not reside. Then they also talk about how they're more effective because they can distribute resources better. But we don't actually see that this is going to be true. We in fact think that social cohesion by leaders is more important thing to uphold. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we think that a technocracy loses in terms of a democracy when it comes to a crisis. We're very proud to oppose.
All right, I thank that speaker for their speech. I'd like to call upon the member of government to extend on their team's case.
Hello, is everyone able to hear me?
Yeah, all good. Go ahead when you're ready.
Start.
One important piece of framing to start closing government's contribution to this debate, which will entirely bypass what is an incredibly marginal opening half. And that piece of framing is to note that in most circumstances, democratically elected governments will heed the advice of the same experts that we'd employ as technocrats. We know that to end because it is for your country to be suffering or for something terrible to be going on. That means you get the same policies, the same advice, and you're likely to also have people follow. All our opening government tries to do is suggest, well, technocrats doing this would maybe make things more efficient, but that isn't particularly important to the extent that you'll get these policies in. Our massive contribution bypasses this opening clash because it pivots the importance of the debate to whether the response will be good or are technocrats broadly good, which is what opening opposition wants to talk about, to firstly, the political ramifications of these crises, especially in the long term, and the policies and personas that come out of the leaders through those crises. And the second thing to note is the extent to which people are likely to cooperate with the policies that are going to be the same on both sides to end those crises. Those are the two metrics that are most important in this debate, and those are the two main extensions we're going to to run. Firstly, political ramifications. Secondly, on cooperation. And thirdly, if I have time for it, a bit of a principled push. Firstly, on political ramifications, there are 6 things I want to talk about here that are unique contributions. The first thing to say, and a lot of this is directly responsive to that which opening opposition talks about when they say, well, you have now a threat of autocracy coming in, is that in times of crisis, that is often those times when the most authoritarian policies and measures are put in place by governments. That is to say, increasingly, a lot of governments around the world, I know in Australia, for example, they're starting to have police drones. At the point where a government implements those policies, and it is just the same government implementing those policies that will continue on until the next election, there's a risk that those policies will not be relinquished, or at least not relinquished to the extent that they normally are. This is empirically true as well, because if you think about the 9/11 response that went on in America, just think to the extent to which the level of surveillance on everyday citizens under the guise of fighting a crisis went up. You ceded that ground of your liberty and suddenly you were being mass surveilled anywhere you went. That was something that was particularly devastating. We think this is comparatively far less likely to occur at the point where there is a different administration in power for the length of the crises. That is to say, the unique policies that they implement will probably be scrutinized much more closely at the point that they have to depart and there is some official transition to democracy. Note as well quickly, there will be a transition back to democracy. I think you'd have to be, I think it is quite silly to believe opening opposition's characterization that these technocrats will just stay in power forever. Obviously, there'll be measures before you employ these technocrats in the first place that suggest if we pass these thresholds, you're kicked out of administration. That is why we think you get less authoritarian policies. And we thought it was those authoritarian policies, often passed with the best of intentions through times of crisis, that were most likely to lead to dictatorial regimes. It was the slow cession of your liberties to authorities that was most devastating on this regard. No, thank you. The second thing I want to talk about is why leaders are made. The second thing about the political ramifications of employing technocrats is that under the status quo, leaders are made to look far better than they actually are. 2 pieces of framing are important here, or characterization, I suppose. The first thing to note is that the crises will end at some point, probably irrespective of that which the government does. If the crises don't end, well, then it's not a crisis, it's just the status quo. And the second thing to note is under the status quo, those leaders are just plastered all over the news. Alan, think about how many times you've had to see Scott Morrison every night on the news.
Here.
The response that you make, even though the people who actively are spearheading those responses are those technocrats whose advice you are following. You then start to attribute internally, whether you consciously do it or not, the government response to a crisis that will inevitably end to that leader specifically. That is devastating because it divorces that leader from their actual capability as a politician, and rather you start to see them as this revered figurehead that opening opposition suggests they should be. You start to see them as some spearhead of the nation that is so particularly revered, and that meant the political ramifications of that leader were not held to account. The prime example here is George Bush, whose 2004 electoral campaign was effectively like, oh, remember, I responded to 9/11. I hate terrorism. That was the same sort of stuff that allowed, I think it was Rudy Giuliani especially, to carry such goodwill with the American populace for so long, divorced from the awful political things that they did, divorced from the fact that they eradicated the middle class in America. The third reason this has devastating political ramifications is because leaders are able to spin these disasters for political gain, and often personal gain, in particularly nefarious ways. That is that they're able to say, well, it was the other party's fault that this disaster has arisen because their policies didn't actively assure us against us. You get partisanism at a time where you don't want it. Or those leaders start to pass grants, for example, to combat those things that look good. For example, they're passing huge grants towards particular fire services, but it is later discovered that those fire services are only entirely administered by their mates, by donors of the party inherently. Or you set up disaster responses in such a politicized way, long term as well. Often in times of crises, these governments are given access to national parks, for example, in the context of Australia during those bushfires. And suddenly at the point where governments have more access to those areas under firstly the guise of spinning a crisis, then eventually what they're able to do is actively build mines there, start drilling and fracking. We thought the political gain that you could gain off a tragedy was something we didn't want. No, thank you. The fourth political ramification that this had was the increased centralization of authority. That was to say at the point where Scott Morrison's on the news every night, it's easy for him to shift blame to lower parts of authority who he would suggest have failed, for example, onto rural fire services or whatever, or in the context of coronavirus, maybe to, cruise liners or airliners, or just broadly to China. We think that centralizes authority in a way that can be particularly nefarious. I'll take a point from our opening.
Taken.
Could you do more to defend your comparative about how you don't have as many branches under government that are able to divide the rebuilding infrastructure on different levels within society during a crisis?
Obviously, when technocrats are employed, not like 100% of the administration of that country goes into simply solving the crises. Obviously, you still have separate arms of government that operate, such as to carry out policies, but they're probably just in those times not making massive shifts to policies. So even if something like they still exist, I don't think that is particularly important. The final reason this has poor political ramifications is that it just pauses things like elections. OG only give the headline of the point. We give the impact, and we say that people are still forced to go out to vote in US primaries, even though they shouldn't be going outside. Second thing to talk about is why people are more likely to cooperate with these crises very quickly. Firstly, it's because most people trust experts. Secondly, experts articulate instructions better than leaders do. Think about the confusing messaging that has come, especially out of the Trump administration. But the third thing to note is that people will just disregard government advice on the political bases of that advice. For example, a lot of people might not accept things that Scott Morrison or Donald Trump says solely on the basis that they don't like those figures. They're far more likely to be trusting and heed the genuine good advice that exists on both sides if you specifically follow, if that was specifically coming from an authoritative figure. That characterization as to why those policies are the same, but the political ramifications, is why we clearly are winning this debate.
All right, I thank that speaker for their speech. I'd like to call upon the member of opposition to extend on their team's case. Hear, hear.
Start.
There are three areas I want to cover in this speech. Firstly, on context and what a technocracy even means. Just at the top of this debate, I would like to say I'm shocked that all three teams didn't define what a technocracy was. All of them just assumed that technocracy are a group of skilled individuals. But this is not true for three reasons. The first, it's just because you're a researcher or academic doesn't mean you're always right. It just means you know more about the situation, but it doesn't guarantee that you're always correct. But secondly, crisis tends to be unique. So just because an academic has research about past crises does not make him always correct in the new one. But thirdly, something I'll mention later in my principal arguments about how many of times you have to weigh up incommensurate moral values. And that's not something that just being a technocrat allows you to do. So what would we prefer instead on opposition? We would prefer having politicians make the final decision. And we are all right with them consulting a diverse board of technocrats. Just as the final decision should lie in the hands of politicians. No, thank you. But there's another thing that was not defined well in this debate, which is what happens in the time of crisis. We tell you that there are actually broad government powers them, such as over the military and private lives of individuals. No, thank you. Something I will cover later on in my principal grounds. But this also means that OG's stance is very problematic because they say they will only have such a policy in the time of crisis. Really? But your reasons, such as populism, your examples, Brexit, Duterte's extrajudicial killings, none of them are done during times of crisis. All of them still continue to apply during regular political situations. They've never proven this, and it's deadly to that case. But recognize another problem with technocrats is there are little to no checks on their behavior. No, thank you. The only thing that we got from the entire government bench so far was, but there can be peer reviews. Okay, first of all, peer reviews are done by other privileged experts, not the general populace. We would rather the general populace be the ones checking on such experts rather than having fellow experts or fellow privileged individuals do so. But secondly, what's the point of a peer review if you can't be removed from office for it? There's no point of a check and balance if the check and balance has no meaning or concrete harms. This brings me to the second area of my speech, the principles grounds. Why is it that a democracy is far more justified in a time of crisis? Governments have broad powers. No, thank you. My first extension, something OO never considered. Oftentimes, we need politicians to weigh up incommensurate moral values. Many government decisions, even in a time of crisis, are not technical in nature and involve weighing different ideals. One example is this coronavirus outbreak. Should we release untested drugs into the market if we are unsure whether or not they could save lives? It is not clear. Or let's say in the time of war, if China were to invade Taiwan one day, should Taiwan surrender or fight till its death? All of these involve weighing up different ideals. There is no one clear correct answer. Even something as technical as monetary policy, such as Greece's loan mentioned by Prime Minister, why is taking a bailout always better? The Greeks had to sacrifice free healthcare for the poor and the middle class and the sick who relied heavily on it if they were to take such bailout. So it's uncertain. Why is it that a technocratic decision of a bailout is always better? Hence, it is unjust to have technocrats make such moral decisions in our place. It's better if we have politicians we democratically voted in do this for us. So what are the rebuttals that we hear from government? There are two things. The first they say is, oh, but there may be panic of the layman. Okay, we accept that the layman may be panicked. That is why we put decisions in the hands of calm representatives. That is the idea behind a representative democracy. That during peacetime, you cast your vote for a politician who during times of crisis will act in your best interest. The second rebuttal we hear is, oh, but there may be populist tendencies. I'm so sorry, but why is this necessarily wrong? Don't let them use pander to the populace as a bad word. Why is it that in times of crisis, appealing to the needs of as many people as possible in the population is something necessarily wrong? We contest this and we believe that the government should serve their people instead. Third area of my speech, no thank you, on the practical areas. Why is it that we are better with a democracy than with a technocracy? And here I'll deal with closing government's 6 so-called practical ramifications, but let's be clear, there are only 3 real arguments here. The first real argument he had was governments are authoritarian in a crisis, so you need more scrutiny. Right, but you also need more concrete checks and balances like voting and separation of power. That's something we have on our side, not present on yours. The second political ramification was politicians are seen as heroes and therefore not scrutinized. I'm sorry, that's not a reason for technocracy because technocrats can be seen as heroes as well. That is a reason for not having a government not exclusive to their side of the debate. Third reason they had was, oh, but certain governments may be superficial and corrupt. Again, it is not exclusive from technocrats. They never prove this comparative. But if anything, politicians want long-term career survival. So during times of crisis, they want to position themselves, as mentioned, to be a hero. So by doing so, they will make sure that the decisions they make are truly those that take care of the best interests of the citizens. If they will not be superficial and corrupt if they want to survive as a government. No, thank you. So now I'll move on to the extensions of our side. Firstly, on the incentives. Secondly, on ability. Under incentives, there are 2 main areas I want to cover. The first is that actually technocrats tend to be very misled. They always want to think that they are correct because they're academics, they're researchers. They want to prove to their field that their ideals are always right. So let's say they pass the wrong policy, then they won't change it because they want to stick by their guns to show that they're always correct. No, thank you. Or let's say you institute a diverse board of technocrats. Then you know what you get? Political deadlock. That is far worse than on our side. But why is it that politicians are much more likely to be better actors on our side? Because politicians work on a compromise. They know how to do this compromise. They've entered politics for a long time and understood this. And they do not want to look like they're obstructing any form of possible progress in a crisis. The second area is that technocrats tend to be elites, live in ivory towers with little to no checks, especially the technocrats that we put in such positions. We give you the example of how economic boards all around the world are filled with Goldman Sachs investment bankers, people who are unlikely to have cared for the common layman. This is a majoritarian view that lets minorities to be ignored. As compared, politicians care about the minority vote. Now we know what they're going to say, oh, but politicians can just scapegoat minorities or ignore minorities. That's not true. In many democracies around the world, there's a strong uprising of minorities where they refuse to be silent. They turn out in large number in polls, they do protests, they are well represented within our democracies. Second area, ability. Public acceptance and trust is very important. This is something opening opposition never really covered. This is going to expand it even more in my latest speaker. Very proud to stand in closing opposition.
All right, I thank that speaker for their speech. I'd like to recognise the government whip to conclude their team's case. Hear, hear.
Hi, can everyone hear?
Yep, all good. Just go when you're ready.
Start.
The entire opposition bench in this debate had an uncomparative fixation on abstract benefits of democracy without ever really engaging with what we wanted to tell you about the actual mechanisms of technocracy and the way that having a kind of brief departure into technocracy left the independence of government and democracy better in the long run. What I'm going to do in this speech is firstly talk about whether this was principally justified, and then I'll engage with what side invited better management of crises. First of all, on whether this was principally justified. What we hear from both opposition teams was essentially the claim that democracy was the best form of government. They, at opening opposition, they tell us two things. They first tell us that at the point where you have a technocracy, it will not go away. And then secondly, much more persuasively perhaps, they tell us, oh, well, you can just have experts supporting the elected politicians. Responding to that, first, I think it is ridiculous for the opposition bench in this debate to fixate on a return to normal and on the potential for autocracy as a result of this. This is ridiculous for two reasons. First of all, it was incredibly simple to have a return to normal clause or like a sunset clause in whatever legislation enacted this. Obviously, that is like the same with any legislation that allows for exceptional powers. The second thing, though, is that throughout this debate, the opposition bench has given you examples of elected politicians that have gone on to cement their power and become autocrats as a result of crises, which would suggest to me then that the return to normal occurs on our side and not on theirs. So I think responding to the stuff about experts just supporting, we offer the most important material in this debate, which uniquely responds to this. We tell you that we are the side which protects democracy for the reason that we allow a return to normal that does not glorify politicians and give them undue centralized power. What are the reasons for that? First of all, we tell you that there is a tendency to create permanent crisis conditions at the point where politicians are emboldened and there is no sort of mandated return to normal. Basically, what that means is what we saw after 9/11. Clearly, that allows for the centralization of power. Second of all, we tell you that there is empirically a soaring approval rates after a crisis. See George Bush post 9/11. That was something that was very unfair. It was frequently unearned. It affected future elections in a way which was fundamentally undemocratic. Third of all, we told you that there was a blame game that was incredibly counterproductive that went on between different governments, different levels of government and private society, which resulted in a lack of responsibility for that government and a lack of accountability into the future. Fourthly, we told you that elections in crisis conditions were very bad, either because they forced people to go out dangerously, which allowed for huge amounts of voter suppression and corruption, or because they allowed a democratically elected government to stay in without an election. Both of those scenarios were clearly bad, and we thought this at least avoided that because it meant that you went into a period of technocracy for the duration of the crisis, and then you could go back to normal without either inviting voter suppression or allowing for the cementation of an elected government. Finally, we told you that there was a propensity for corruption and disaster capitalism, which only occurred when you had kind of short-termist electoral interests to care about the economy and things like that, rather than, for instance, being a doctor and prioritizing, for instance, the Hippocratic Oath. It was the case that politicians had lobbying interests and interest to party donors and ideological interests that led to that form of corruption. This means that we uniquely engage with this material about democracy because we prove that in the long run, we prevent a slide into autocracy, which was clearly what the opposition bench particularly cared about in this debate. Note that we helpfully also give you the example of central banks, which I think is one of the best kind of analogies in this debate with regards to principal justification, because obviously central banks can work responsibly in times of fiscal crisis. Obviously, there is a clear precedent of having an independent arm of government and policy making, which I think clearly responds to the stuff that we heard at CO about precedent. Finally, we hear a response from closing opposition to our extension, where they tell us, well, obviously these technocrats will also be seen as heroes. This completely misses the point. The point is that after the return to normal, apart from maybe some professional reputation, these technocrats do not benefit off that. They do not get to win successive presidential elections because of their reputation garnered from those actions. So I think that is just like, they've completely missed the point there. That rebuttal falls down. At the end of this point, note that we are the first team to properly engage with the long-term incentives of this. This thoroughly responds to the material you heard from all the opposition benches, which they chose to frame as the most important material in the debate about democracy. I think we win on those grounds alone, but I'll move on now to what invites better management. But first, a point of information if anyone has one. Okay. Oh, yeah, cool.
Taken.
So under your world, how do you ensure that the public will be willing to abide by policies proposed by technocrats when they don't actually feel represented within these ideas themselves?
Fantastic. So I'm going to respond to this in this point, but briefly, I think it is very obvious that a significant minority in most societies of the population does not support a democratically elected government, which means it is unclear why like a good 30% of the Australian population would enjoy taking instructions from Scott Morrison. Okay, moving on to this, I guess, more thoroughly. So what we hear from opening opposition
Point.
is, no thank you, I'll take no more POIs, is four main claims. First of all, they tell us at LO that no one can actually talk to each other in times of crisis. Clearly untrue, so I think we can discount that. The second thing they tell us, for instance, in that POI, is there will be a lack of social cohesion in these times, which will result in unrest. I think we give you the most thorough response. Actually, there was no response at opening government to this, and I think this is very powerful. We tell you that people do have a higher amount of trust in experts. People usually will believe a doctor when they give them medical advice, but additionally and importantly, these experts had a better ability to articulate instructions than, for instance, Scott Morrison, which meant that people would believe it. But finally, we told you that obviously minorities would be excluded when you had a majoritarian government making those decisions. You, in fact, had an incentive to sacrifice minorities who were not particularly important in your electorate, and therefore we thought the majority of people would clearly be on board. You would have greater levels of social cohesion. Note that CO clearly concedes that point when they tell us, oh, well, you can just have protests of minorities in like coronavirus. Absurd. The next thing we hear is that, oh, well, experts are privileged, and this might, stop people from trusting the experts. But I think this is uncomparative because obviously governments have problems with privilege, but at least a chief doctor had signed a Hippocratic oath and had professional duties to care about those things. Then we hear at CO one of their kind of, wasn't a very thorough extension, I suppose, but they tell us, oh, well, these people need to make moral values and trade-offs. Clearly, a doctor is better placed to make judgments about approving medicines than a random politician. Obviously, experts get taught how to use things like the precautionary principle. It was completely absurd to suggest that they were unqualified to make those. Finally, the stuff we heard about arrogance and political deadlock was insanely uncomparative. It was far more likely to occur when people were burdened with ideology and party differences. We were the only team in this debate to actually engage with a clear, thorough characterization of what this disaster response looked like, to engage with the long term, and we had unique responses regarding social cohesion, how to affect.
Right, I thank that speaker for their speech. I'd like to recognise the opposition whip to conclude today's debate. We're here.
Testing, can you hear me like this?
Yep, all good.
Here.
Ready when you are.
Start.
It is London in 1940. The German Air Force is over their heads, and people are forced to flee to the countryside. Winston Churchill walks into the halls of Westminster Abbey, and he asks his advisors what he should do. Every single advisor in the room tells him that he should sign a peace treaty with Germany and that he should give up. It is Winston Churchill who replies, "It is in this trying time, it is the will of the British people to fight on." I think when CG tells you that there's a chance of government control under their side of the house, I would suspect that those are problems that will be solved with more democracy, not less. I don't think any of the responses towards our side's principle was completely justified, given that it came in the last 15 seconds of the previous speaker's speech. I think they were far too late to contest the material in this debate. Furthermore, I would suggest to you that their side has completely missed the point of Kenneth's extension, because what we told you about was the fact that often technocrats get it wrong as well. We were the only team in this debate to point out that technocrats aren't always the skilled and perfectly objective individuals that they would like to talk about. Sometimes they get things wrong as well, be it throughout history or in the very instances that Kenneth talked to you about at the start of his speech. Their failure to respond in the previous speaker is indicative of their unwillingness to engage. I'm going to ask two questions. One, do technocrats have a right to hijack the political system? Two, do they do things better? One, on democracy. O tells you why democracy is important, but he do not explain why this is the case. It is Kenneth's extension that gives you the necessary weighing, the necessary logic, and the necessary framing for why it is important that in the status quo, we ensure that in times of crisis, that these people remain there. We give you two reasons specifically. First, because often in crisis, a government is the one that has the most control. Oftentimes, the constitution is overwritten. Oftentimes, it is things like the military that take over. very fact that OG talks about things like Viktor Orban is the point that we are making within this argument, that no country and no government should have that much obscene and violent power over their people.
Point.
Our argument was that in those cases, it is only justified that this power be placed in the hands of the individuals who are most affected by these things. No, thank you. Secondly, we told you about the fact that there was incommensurate moral values being placed here. Think, for
Point.
instance, about the COVID-19 outbreak. Do we want to sacrifice some
Point.
COVID cases for some economic growth and for ensuring people get back to work? These are questions that no expert can answer, regardless of how many statistics they have, how many research papers they have done, how many citations they have within
Point.
academia. These are questions that can only be answered by people themselves, who will be the ones that are affected by this problem. This was the extent of the extension we gave you. That is the most important thing in this debate, because we fill the hole in the democracy argument that was made very poorly in OO. What then did they tell you? The only response that they were deigned to give was towards our second point of incommensurate values. And they tell you,
Point.
doctors make the decisions for patients, therefore it should apply in this circumstance as well. No, we don't think it's a good idea for doctors to make
Point.
decisions for their patients. Think about it. In the status quo, we give patients the ability to decide whether or not they want chemotherapy to extend the quantity of life, or whether or not they want to choose the quality of life instead. Do they want to go through agonizing treatment, or do they want to have a good and fair goodbye towards their loved ones? They have not given us a reason why it's illegitimate for some people to choose some things over the other. At the end of the day, I think CG completely misunderstands our extension, because our extension is not that
Point.
democracy is the best form of governance. Our extension is that it's the only form of governance which is legitimate and which is justified. At the end of the day, the state cannot have more power than the people. They should serve the people rather than the other way around.
Point.
Secondly, even if you choose to ignore our entire principle
Point.
extension, I'm going to give you reasons why technocrats are the worst place in to deal with these problems. We gave you two reasons about why they lack the incentive and why they lack the ability,
Point.
which received very little response from the previous speech. The first, we talked to you about lack of incentive. They want to protect their own interests. They often want to be very dogmatic and show that they have always been correct about this particular stance. Hence, they are very unlikely to budge within these scenarios in crisis. But secondly, we show that they often lack the ability,
Point.
because they are not always correct. Oftentimes, they lack the framework for which they can decide these moral values for people that they often do not know. I think what we saw in the previous speaker was that she simply chose to retreat towards the 6 points of analysis that were given to you by MG. I'm going to do a very unorthodox thing here. I'm going to tackle all of these points and show you why in all of these scenarios, the point probably falls to us. First, democratic governments also implement bad policies, such as 9/11. This is an argument for more democracy, because I would suspect if people could vote on things like the Patriot Act, they would have chosen to reject it outright. Therefore, I would suggest that this is an argument for our team, not theirs. Secondly, they tell you that leaders make for better individuals, because they
Point.
tell you that leaders oftentimes don't make good politicians, because they often want to have themselves revert for the rest of time. Again, this is an argument for more democracy, more journalists, a freer media, more ability to excavate things and ensure that these unsavory things are put in the public light and debated. Third, they tell that they can spin it for political gain. Not true. Many governments have been brought down by crises as well.
Point.
Think about the fact that once the economy collapsed in Eastern Europe, in North Africa, that was when we actually be able to get change and remove those people from
Point.
office. Fourth, elections have to, you cannot have elections during this time because people cannot go out. There'll be huge amount of
Point.
corruption. I would suggest that you can do things like in Wisconsin, where what they did now is that they can vote
Point.
by mail. I'm not sure why democracy
Point.
cannot exist in our current scenario.
Your entire extension is contingent on the fact that technocrats often lack expertise, even though the info slide specifically suggests that they do have expertise. Technocracy doesn't look like one doctor unilaterally making decisions, rather a panel of them consider all evidence. Don't you think a doctor knows more about medicine than Donald Trump does?
Well, but the fact is that one of them is democratically elected and one of them is not. You might have all the expertise in the world, but I don't think that means they can choose for many individuals out there what is the best life for themselves and what their relationship with the state should look like. The extent of our principle argumentation was to tell you that on our side of the house, we allow people the agency and the ability to make choices that does not exist for the majority of people under your side. At the end of the day, I think another important thing that we talked about was about the idea of public trust. How under our side of the house, we were the side that was able to get cooperation from the people. On their side, when things come as dictates from these individuals who remain at the top of academia and of technocracy, On our side, it comes from leaders who then are able to spiritually connect with individuals from people who have been democratically elected. At the end of the day, it's on our side of the house where we solve the crisis not just faster, but better. Therefore, you should work with
All right. I thank all speakers for an excellent debate.